Paul Revere ended the American Revolution under arrest, not for treason, for cowardice, accused of it after the worst naval disaster in American history before Pearl Harbor. And then he did something almost no accused man ever does. He spent the next 2.5 years demanding that the government put him on trial. You know the other Paul Revere, the Midnight Rider, 1 if by land, 2 if by sea, the lantern in the steeple and the cry in the dark, the British are coming. Almost none of that happened the way you were taught. But that is not the dark story. The dark story is the one that ends with a Boston silversmith confined to his own house, stripped of his command, with one ugly word hanging over his name. This is the story of how the most famous messenger in America ended the war as a suspect. It runs through a spy ring with a real traitor inside it, a traitor whose name was not Revere. It runs through a rank he was never allowed to have. And it ends on a river in Maine, in the summer of 1779, with more than 40 American ships burning. If you have ever heard that there is a traitor story about Paul Revere, this is it. And the truth is stranger, and far more human, than the rumor. Start with the ride, not the poem, the ride. In 1775, Paul Revere was 40 years old, and he was not a soldier. He was a silversmith, one of the best in Boston, a maker of teapots and buckles and engraved copper plates. He had a workshop, a growing family, and a side trade in trouble. For years he had been the Patriots' courier, carrying the news of the Tea Party to New York, the Suffolk Resolves to Philadelphia, riding hundreds of miles at a stretch. So when the moment came on the night of April 18, 1775, the man they sent was a professional. This part is true. He really did ride. But he did not ride alone, and he did not shout, "The British are coming." To the people he was warning, they were all still British. The word he used was regulars. The king's regular troops are coming out. He was one of dozens of riders spreading the alarm through a network built for exactly this night. And the 2 lanterns in the North Church steeple were not a signal he was waiting for. They were a signal he sent, his own backup plan, in case he was caught before he could cross the river. Which he nearly was, because Revere did not finish the ride. A few miles past Lexington, a British patrol stepped out of the dark and stopped him. An officer put a pistol to his head and told him that if he lied, he would blow his brains out. They took his horse and let him walk. It was a younger man named Samuel Prescott who slipped away and carried the warning the last miles into Concord. The most famous ride in American history was real, and it was dangerous. And it did not reach the place the poem says it reached. So where did the Silver Rider come from? From a poem. Henry Wadsworth Longfellow wrote Paul Revere's Ride in 1860, almost a century later, and published it in a magazine that reached readers the week South Carolina left the Union. Longfellow knew the facts. He chose the legend. He needed a lone hero waking a sleeping country, because his own country was about to tear itself in half. The rider we remember was built for a different war. That is the Paul Revere everyone knows, sanded down and set in bronze. The real man was pricklier, hungrier, and more interesting. And to see the first crack in the statue, go back a few months before the ride, into a room full of men who had sworn each other to secrecy. Because there was a traitor in Paul Revere's story, just not the one the rumor means. In the winter before the war, Revere belonged to a secret committee in Boston, about 30 men, mostly tradesmen and mechanics, who met to watch the British garrison and track its movements. They were spies. They swore themselves to secrecy on a Bible, and it did no good at all, because everything they said in that room seemed to reach the British commander, General Gage, within days. Revere wrote about it himself, years later. There was, he said, a traitor in their councils. He even wrote the word down, traitor. The traitor was a man named Dr. Benjamin Church. He was respected, well-connected, a member of the Provincial Congress, and he sat inside Revere's own circle. He was also feeding the British everything. In the autumn of 1775, Church was caught passing a letter written in cipher. When they decoded it, it was addressed to the enemy. A deacon remembered seeing him once walk out of a room with General Gage, the 2 of them talking like men who had known each other a long time, and a man who had no honest reason for it had somehow come into a pocket full of new British gold. So when someone asks whether there is a traitor in the Paul Revere story, yes, there is. But Revere was not the traitor. He was one of the men that traitor was betraying, and in his own account of it, Revere was the one who named the name. That is the true shape of the thing the rumor gets exactly backwards. Here is the irony that would shadow the rest of his life. The man who helped expose a real traitor would himself be charged one day. Not with treason, but with something an 18th century soldier feared nearly as much. And the reason he was ever in a position to be charged at all comes down to a single, gnawing frustration. Paul Revere wanted to be a soldier. The army would not quite let him. When the war came, Revere wanted what he had never had: a real commission in the Continental Army, the regular force under George Washington. He lobbied for it. He did not get it. The appointments went to other men, and at least one fellow officer seems to have worked to keep him down. What he got instead was a consolation prize, a lieutenant colonel's rank in the Massachusetts State Artillery, and command of the garrison at Castle Island, out in Boston Harbor. It was a desk. It was drilling men and minding cannon, while the real war happened somewhere else. By his own contemporaries' account, Revere's ambition ran a little ahead of his military talent. He wanted, badly, to prove himself in a real fight. For 3 years, the harbor garrison gave him no chance to. And then, in the summer of 1779, the chance came, sailing up the coast of Maine. It would be the worst thing that ever happened to him. It began with a fort where there was not supposed to be a fort. In June of 1779, British troops landed on the Penobscot River, in what is now Maine, and was then the far northern edge of Massachusetts. On a bluff at a place called Bagaduce, they began to build a base, a foothold on the coast, a harbor for loyalists, a knife pointed at the whole New England shore. Massachusetts decided the fort could not be allowed to stand. And the answer the state assembled was enormous. It was the largest American naval expedition of the entire Revolutionary War. More than 40 vessels sailed north, warships and privateers and transports, over 1,000 militia and Marines, and an artillery train to batter the fort into surrender. It was a whole state's naval strength, gathered in one place, for one blow. Paul Revere commanded the artillery, around 100 men and their cannon, aboard an ordnance brig near the front of the fleet. This was it. This was the real command he had wanted for years. He was finally sailing toward the fight, and then the expedition did the one thing that could ruin it: nothing. The ground commander would not storm the fort until the Navy sailed in to support him. The Navy's commodore, a cautious man named Saltonstall, would not sail his ships into the harbor until the fort had already fallen. Each waited for the other. Councils of war argued in circles aboard the flagship. Days passed, then a week, then more, and the British, inside the half-finished fort, who could not believe their luck, used every hour of it to dig deeper. For 3 weeks, the greatest fleet America had ever launched sat in a Maine bay and quarreled with itself. The soldiers who did get ashore skirmished up the wooded bluffs and waited for the order to finish the job. The order never came, and every day they wasted, a question was sailing toward them from the south, getting closer with the tide. On the 13th of August, the question arrived. A British relief fleet came around the headland with the wind behind it. Ships of the line, real warships of the Royal Navy, more than a match for anything the Americans had. And the American commanders, who could never agree on how to attack, now had to agree on something far worse: how to run. What happened next was not a battle, it was a slaughter of ships. The American fleet broke and fled up the Penobscot River, and the British came after them. There was no line of battle, no stand. There was a panic on the water. Trapped against the shallows with the enemy closing, American captains ran their own ships aground and set them on fire, rather than let them be captured. Vessel after vessel went up, burned by the very crews that had sailed them north. The river filled with smoke and the black hulls of a navy destroying itself. More than 40 ships were lost, every last one. The men who survived were put ashore into 100 miles of wilderness and told to find their own way home. They straggled back through the Maine woods for weeks. Hungry, scattered, some of them barefoot, hundreds of Americans were killed, captured, or simply lost. The British, dug into their fort, lost around a dozen men. It was the most complete naval defeat the United States would suffer for another 162 years, until a Sunday morning at Pearl Harbor. When the bill came due, it nearly bankrupted the state of Massachusetts. Someone was going to answer for this. The Commodore, Saltonstall, was court-martialed and thrown out of the Navy, the expedition's true scapegoat. But a smaller storm was already gathering around the artillery officer from Boston. Within weeks of dragging himself home, Paul Revere was not being welcomed as a survivor. He was being accused. The accusation came from a Marine captain named Thomas Carnes, and it was as ugly as an accusation could be. It rested on two moments during the retreat. In the first, a general named Wadsworth ordered Revere to hand over one of his boats to help rescue the crew of a stranded schooner drifting toward the enemy. Revere argued. He said Wadsworth had no authority over him and that the boat was loaded with his own baggage. He gave it up in the end, and the rescue was made, but he had hesitated, and men remembered the hesitation. In the second, when the whole army came apart, Revere took his men and left the Penobscot without a direct order to do it. He brought them home. His enemies called it desertion of his post. Carnes put it in writing. He charged Revere with disobedience and with unsoldierly conduct during the whole expedition. Conduct, he wrote, that tended toward cowardice. There it was. Not treason, never treason. But for a man who had spent his life trying to be taken seriously as a soldier, cowardice was the one word that could cut the deepest. And now it sat in the official record, in a Marine captain's own hand. On the 6th of September, 1779, the order came down. Paul Revere was relieved of his command of Castle Island and told to go home, to remain at his own house while the affair was investigated. The most famous rider in Massachusetts, the man who had carried the alarm to Lexington, was under something very close to house arrest in the middle of Boston. He had wanted a soldier's reputation his whole life. Now he had one, and it was the wrong kind. The inquiries began, and they did something almost crueler than blame. The first committee looked into the disaster, faulted the Commodore, and did not mention Revere at all. You might think that would be a relief. It was the opposite. Silence was not the same as innocence. A second committee did name him, found fault with his disputing of Wadsworth's order, and called his leaving not wholly justifiable. So he was left in a kind of limbo, never cleared, never convicted, just quietly set aside under a cloud. Most men, offered a quiet way to let a thing like that fade, would take it. Wait it out. Let the war move on and the memory blur. Paul Revere did the opposite. He decided he would rather be tried and convicted than left alone under suspicion. So he began to fight for the one thing no one wanted to give him, a court-martial of his own. He asked for it once. He was refused, so he asked again. For 2.5 years, Paul Revere petitioned the government of Massachusetts to put him on trial. Again and again, he pressed for the court-martial that would either damn him or clear him. Anything but the silence. It was a strange, stubborn campaign. Most men run from a courtroom. He was chasing one. He wanted his accusers made to stand up in the open and prove what they had written, or take it back. It took years of refusals and dropped threads and letters that went nowhere, and finally, in the winter of 1782, they gave him his day. In February of 1782, nearly 3 years after the ships burned, a court-martial finally convened to try Lieutenant Colonel Paul Revere. By then, the charges had shrunk. The sweeping talk of cowardice was gone. What remained were 2 narrow counts: that he had refused Wadsworth the boat, and that he had left the river without orders. The court heard the witnesses. It heard what the retreat had actually been like, and it weighed the 2 charges, one at a time. On the first charge, the court noted that his refusal had been sudden, in the middle of a rout, and that the boat had, in the end, done the rescue anyway. On the second, it found that the whole army had been in such confusion, so scattered and broken, that no regular orders could have been given to anyone. On both counts, the judgment was the same: not guilty. After 3 years under a cloud, Paul Revere was acquitted. But read the wording, and you can feel the sting in it. The court ordered that he be acquitted, and here are its exact words: with equal honor as the other officers in the same expedition. Equal honor to the other officers. From an expedition where not a single officer had come away with any. It was a vindication with a shrug folded inside it. Revere took the vindication and let the shrug go. After 3 years, he would take what he could get, and that is the traitor story. No treason. No sold secrets. A proud, difficult man. A catastrophe he did not cause. One ugly word, and a stubborn 3-year fight to make the record say what he believed was true. Which leaves one honest question. Was he a good man or not? The record answers. But it does not answer simply. So let's do the thing the poem never did. Let's weigh him honestly. Put the worst on the scale first. He could be vain and sharp-elbowed about credit. There is a famous example, and if you have watched this channel, you already know the picture. The most reproduced image of the Boston Massacre, the tidy firing line, the innocent dead, was engraved by Paul Revere. He did not draw it first. He copied it, almost line for line, from a young artist named Henry Pelham, and rushed his own version to market before Pelham could sell his. As if you had plundered me on the highway, that was how Pelham, in a furious letter, named the theft. Revere took the fame and the profit and never looked back. He was also, by trade, a part-time dentist and a shameless advertiser of it. He ran notices in the Boston papers offering to fix false teeth and boasted that he could set them as well as any surgeon dentist who ever came from London. It sounds like vanity, and it was, but hold on to it, because that boast is about to matter. Now the other side of the scale. In the spring of 1776, the body of his friend Dr. Joseph Warren was lifted from a rough grave on Bunker Hill, 9 months after the British had killed and buried him there. He was past recognizing. Revere knew him anyway, because Revere had wired false teeth into Warren's mouth himself, with his own silversmith's hands, and he recognized his own work. It is remembered as the first time in America a body was identified by its dental work. He had gone to find his friend, and he brought him home. And the ride and the war were only the middle of his life. Paul Revere lived to be 83. He built a foundry and cast more than 900 church bells, some of which still ring in New England today. He opened the first successful copper rolling mill in the country. He rolled the copper sheeting that went onto the hull of the USS Constitution and onto the dome of the Massachusetts State House. The company he founded outlived him by 2 centuries. The messenger became a manufacturer and quietly helped build the young country he had once ridden to warn. So weigh it, a self-promoting man who stole a famous engraving and a loyal one who dug up a friend to bring him home. A soldier accused of cowardice, who had ridden with a pistol at his head and who then spent 3 years demanding the trial that could have destroyed him rather than live 1 hour under a lie. Terrible person does not survive contact with the record. Neither does the flawless silver hero. What is left is something better than either. What is left is a man. Ambitious, thin-skinned, brave, stubborn, gifted, and proud. A man who was very good at some things and reached for others he could never quite grasp. Who helped expose a real traitor, survived the worst naval disaster in the country's history to that point, and refused, for 2.5 years, to let it be written down as cowardice. Longfellow gave America a silver rider on a midnight road. The truth gave it something harder to fit in a poem, and far better worth knowing. Not a hero, not a traitor. A man who would not let the last word about him be a lie. He spent his life carrying messages. In the end, the one he fought hardest to deliver was the truth about himself. For more big stories told small, like and subscribe to Mainstreet Miniatures.